The morning sun over Fort Kestrel was merciless, spilling across the yard in waves of blinding gold that turned steel to fire and sweat to salt. The desert stretched endlessly around the base, flat and unforgiving, mirroring the atmosphere that hung thick in the air. Boots thudded in rhythm, orders barked and echoed off the barracks walls, and the metallic scent of oil, dust, and heat fused into something raw and heavy. This was not a place for the faint-hearted, it was a machine of discipline, a place where weakness was not corrected, but crushed. Captain Mara Holt stood at attention in the front line, the line where every movement was scrutinized, where every breath felt like a test. Her uniform was pressed, her posture unyielding, her eyes hidden behind regulation issue shades that reflected only the blinding light. She didn't fidget, she didn't blink. To the untrained eye, she was just another officer following orders. But to anyone paying attention, there was something too still about her, a kind of silence that carried weight, not submission. Then came General Rourke. The man was legend and warning rolled into one, a tall, broad-shouldered brute, of a leader with a reputation built on fear and results. His medals glinted under the sun like weapons. His presence alone seemed to drain the air from the parade ground. Men straightened instinctively when he passed, not out of respect, but out of survival. He was the kind of officer who didn't inspire loyalty, he enforced it. He stopped 3 paces in front of Mara. His eyes, pale and sharp, traveled down her uniform, pausing on the smallest thing, a smudge of dust clinging stubbornly to her boot. It wasn't much, but to Rourke, it was enough. "Captain Holt," he barked, voice low and cold. "You come to inspection like this?" The silence that followed was brutal. Mara met his gaze, chin lifted just enough to show she'd heard him, but not enough to challenge him. "Sir," she said evenly, "I was in the motor pool at 0400 hours. Did I ask for an excuse?" His words cracked through the air like a whip. "I asked why you're standing in my formation looking like a mud rat." A few soldiers in the back shifted their weight, glancing at each other. They'd seen Rourke humiliate people before it was part of the ritual. Break them early, make them small. But there was something different in the way Holt stood there, still and steady, her jaw set, her silence heavy enough to make even the wind pause. Rourke took a step closer, his boots grinding against the gravel. The tension coiled tighter. "You think silence makes you look strong, Captain?" he growled. "You think I don't see that little smirk hiding behind your discipline?" She didn't answer. She didn't even blink, and that quiet defiance was what snapped the thread. Before anyone could move, Rourke's hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of her hair at the base of her skull and yanking her head back. Gasps rippled through the line. Time fractured one half of the yard frozen in disbelief, the other half too afraid to breathe. The sound of her hair pulling tight against his grip sliced through the silence like a blade. Mara didn't cry out. She didn't flinch, her eyes sharp, blue, unyielding, locked on his. The world narrowed to that single, impossible moment. A general's rage, a captain's restraint, and an entire unit watching history teeter on a knife's edge. He hissed close to her ear, his breath hot and sour. "You forget your place, Holt. You think you're better than this uniform." For a long second she said nothing. Then, slowly, she exhaled a calm, deliberate sound, like the release of something ancient and dangerous. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only those nearest heard it. "No, sir," she said. "I think you have." Something shifted then. Small, unseen, but powerful. Rourke's hand trembled before he let go, his face tightening as if realizing too late that he had gone too far. The soldiers stood motionless, their eyes darting between the two, waiting for anyone to move. Mara adjusted her cap, smoothing her hair back into place as though nothing had happened. Her hands were steady, her eyes were not shaken. When she spoke again, it wasn't defiance, it was command. "Request permission to resume inspection, sir." No one dared laugh, no one dared breathe. And as the desert wind picked up again, sweeping dust across the yard, every soldier knew they'd witnessed something dangerous, not in the general's temper, but in the quiet power of a woman who refused to bow. Mara Holt didn't break that morning, but something else did. Something in the way the base looked at her, and the way they would never look at their general the same again. The wind rolled through Fort Kestrel in slow, burning waves, carrying dust that clung to every surface and every secret. The yard was still humming with tension, the kind that burrows deep under the skin and refuses to fade. The moment the general's hand released Mara Holt, it was as if the whole base had been holding its breath and didn't quite know how to exhale. His shove sent her back a single step, her boots scraping against the gravel, but she didn't stumble. She straightened, adjusted her cap, and looked at him with the same calm precision that had unnerved him in the first place. Her eyes didn't flash with anger. They simply observed, cold, unflinching, patient. General Rourke turned sharply, barking something about insubordination and disrespect for command, his words cutting through the formation like a whip that had lost its sting. He needed noise, the kind that drowns out guilt. Soldiers shifted, saluted, pretended not to see the raw humiliation dripping between their superiors' words. No one spoke. No one dared to. They just stood there, watching as a man who once seemed untouchable walked away with too much force in his stride and not enough control in his eyes. Sergeant Vega's jaw flexed. He was a stocky man, built from loyalty and stubbornness, his dark eyes flicking between Mara and the retreating general. His hands were balled at his sides, every instinct screaming to step forward. But then Mara glanced at him, just one look, a silent command, and he froze in place. Her expression said everything. Asterisk. Not yet. Asterisk. When the formation broke, whispers filled the gaps where courage should have been. Soldiers muttered under their breath, glancing over their shoulders as they dispersed. Some avoided Mara entirely, afraid that being near her would draw Rourke's wrath. Others looked at her with something closer to awe, quiet, uncertain respect for someone who hadn't flinched when power raised its hand. She waited until the yard was empty before she moved. The heat pressed down, the horizon flickering like molten glass, but her steps were slow and deliberate. Each one carried weight, not just of the moment, but of purpose. Inside the officers' quarters, she closed the door behind her and let the silence swallow the remaining noise. Her hand hovered briefly over her neck, where his fingers had tangled in her hair. The skin burned faintly, a reminder not of pain, but of line crossed. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, sharp features, dust streaking her cheek, eyes as steady as steel. Then she reached for the small metal case on her desk, pressing her thumb against the biometric seal. It clicked open with a muted hiss. Inside lay her credentials, not the ones the base knew about. The badge read, Asterisk Asterisk Office of Internal Defense Oversight, Pentagon. Asterisk Asterisk. Her other hand slipped beneath the case, pulling out a drive the size of a dog tag. On it were weeks of data transaction logs, communication intercepts, falsified orders, every breadcrumb leading to the rot buried inside Fort Kestrel's command. Rourke's name sat at the center of it all, printed across redacted reports and hidden files she'd spent months tracing. She hadn't planned to reveal herself yet. The mission required patience, observation, the slow dismantling of corruption from within. But now, that timeline was shifting. The second he touched her, the investigation became personal, not because he humiliated her, but because he proved exactly what kind of man he was. Outside, the base was returning to its routine, engines starting, shouts echoing, drills resuming, but something in the air had changed. The soldiers were quieter, their glances more careful. Power had cracked, even if only for a heartbeat, and they'd all seen the fracture. Vega appeared in her doorway, his boots leaving faint prints in the dust. "You all right, Captain?" he asked, voice low, cautious. Mara closed the metal case, locking it with a soft click. "I've been through worse," she said, not looking up. He hesitated. He crossed a line, everyone saw it. They saw what he wanted them to see, she replied evenly, finally meeting his gaze. Now they'll see what he didn't. Vega frowned, confused, but something in her tone told him not to press. She picked up her cap again, fitting it neatly onto her head, every motion controlled, deliberate. "No one touches what's mine," she said quietly. "Not my name, not my mission." By the time the sun dipped low, the entire base had heard the story in some version exaggerated, softened, distorted. But what none of them knew was that a clock had started ticking the moment the general's hand left her hair. Because Captain Mara Holt wasn't just another officer caught in the gears of command. She was the gear built to break them, and the stillness that followed wasn't peace. It was the pause before judgment. The hum of the air vents was the only sound in Mara Holt's quarters that night. The rest of Fort Kestrel slept uneasily, the desert wind scraping against the tin roofs, the echoes of the day still haunting every barrack and hallway. But inside that small, dimly lit room, there was no rest, only resolve. Mara sat at her desk, her back straight, the glow of her laptop painting her face in cold light. Her fingers moved with precision, no hesitation, no tremor, as line after line of classified data filled the screen. Each document she opened was a wound falsified requisitions, missing shipments of ammunition, unauthorized wire transfers, months of rot disguised under layers of bureaucracy and rank. She leaned back slightly, rubbing her temple. Every report she had pulled had a common thread: Rourke's authorization codes. He'd built an empire of fear, not just with discipline but with deception. The kind of corruption that didn't just stain a base, it weakened the country it was meant to protect. And now, she had it all. Mara opened a small lockbox and took out a flash drive, black, unmarked, the kind only a handful of people in the Pentagon would recognize. She inserted it, encrypted the files, then sat back as the system confirmed. Asterisk, asterisk, upload complete. Asterisk, asterisk. The soft click of the drive being removed felt heavier than it should have. That tiny piece of metal and silicon now held the weight of a man's career and the power to expose everything he'd done. Outside, the night deepened, the base lights flickering like watchful eyes. Mara didn't sleep. She never did before a mission's end. She just stared at the darkness through the small window, her reflection staring back calm, unshaken, inevitable. By morning, Fort Kestrel was bathed in a harsh, silver light. The air felt thick, charged with something unsaid. Officers moved quickly between buildings, the kind of movement that happens when rumors spread faster than orders. At 0900 hours sharp, the briefing began in the command hall, the same hall where countless officers had been stripped of dignity, where Rourke had built his throne of intimidation. Today, the seats were filled with colonels, majors, and captains, all lined up with their notebooks and neutral expressions. Rourke stood at the front, as always, his presence commanding but his eyes restless. He hadn't expected to see Mara Holt walk through those doors. But she did, her uniform flawless, her boots silent on the tile, her face carved from calm steel. The murmur in the room died the moment she entered. She didn't salute him, she didn't even look at him. Instead, she placed a folder on the table, then set the flash drive beside it. "Colonel Avery," she said evenly, addressing the man presiding over the briefing. "These are findings from an ongoing oversight audit conducted under Pentagon Directive 438A. You'll find full financial trails, communication logs, and shipment records attached." Rourke frowned, his voice sharp. "Captain Holt, you are out of line." She cut through him like a blade through silk. "You'll find General Rourke's authorization codes in half of them." A ripple went through the room. The smallest shift of posture, the tightening of shoulders. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her words did the work. Calm, precise, lethal. She turned slightly toward the colonel, her expression unchanged. "Everything you need is in there." Rourke slammed his palm against the table. "This is an ambush. You think you can walk in here with baseless accusations and—" "Enough," the colonel's voice boomed, cutting him off. His tone carried the weight of rank and judgment. He reached for the drive, his expression unreadable as he slid it into the console before him. Lines of code and data filled the main screen. Silence settled again, broken only by the faint hum of the projector. Then the colonel spoke. "General Rourke," he said, slow and deliberate. "You are relieved of command, pending formal investigation." The words hit like artillery. For a moment, Rourke just stood there, motionless. His jaw tightened, his throat moved, but no sound came. His authority, that towering presence built on intimidation, seemed to drain out of him like sand slipping through fingers. Mara didn't move. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped back, hands clasped behind her, posture perfect, gaze forward. Around the table, no one dared to speak. The soldiers who had once avoided her eyes now looked at her with something else entirely: respect, quiet and raw. Rourke's medals gleamed dully in the light, useless now, symbols of a command that had already ended. 2 MPs appeared at the door, waiting silently for the order. The colonel nodded once. Rourke turned, slow and hollow, and walked past Mara without a word. For the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Kestrel, he couldn't meet her eyes. When the doors closed behind him, Mara let out the smallest breath, controlled, measured, almost invisible. Justice never felt clean, she thought. It just felt necessary. And as the room slowly emptied, she stood alone by the table, the flash drive gone, her mission complete. Outside, the sun was high again, the heat unrelenting. But for the first time since she set foot on that base, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like clarity, brutal, blinding, and true. The desert had quieted. Fort Kestrel, once thick with the echo of orders barked in anger and boots pounding in fear, now moved to a different rhythm. Mornings came slower. Commands were sharper, cleaner, but without the weight of threat behind them. Conversations no longer carried the tightness of dread, just the hum of duty. Even the air felt lighter, as if the dust itself had learned to settle differently. Power, it seemed, had changed hands in ways that didn't require words. Mara Holt walked through the corridors of the administrative wing, a manila folder tucked under her arm. Her uniform was crisp as ever, her expression unreadable. No medals pinned, no ceremony to mark what she'd done, only the faint smell of desert wind clinging to her jacket and the quiet respect that followed her footsteps. Officers greeted her now, some with nods, others with silence, unsure how to speak to a woman who had dismantled a tyrant without firing a single shot. Inside the operations office, her desk was bare except for the report she'd spent the last 48 hours completing. It was precise, no embellishment, no judgment, just facts. Asterisk. Asterisk. General Rourke relieved of command. Evidence verified and secured. Investigation pending military tribunal. Asterisk. Asterisk. Her part in it was finished. The rest would play out far above her, in rooms where decisions echoed through ranks like ripples, through still water. She signed the final page and slid it into the outgoing tray. There was no satisfaction in it. Justice wasn't something she celebrated, it was something she executed. She closed the folder, stood, and adjusted her cap before stepping outside. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the parade ground, the heat rolling up from the concrete in slow waves. Training drills were in progress, cadets moving in sync, crisp and focused, their cadence sharp but calm. They looked different than they had a week ago. Straighter, lighter. The kind of discipline that came from pride, not fear. Mara paused for a moment, watching them march, a faint wind tugging at the ends of her hair. Sergeant Vega caught up from behind, his boots scuffing softly against the ground. "You really leaving, ma'am?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Mara glanced at him, a small nod. "My job here's done." He shifted awkwardly, eyes on the ground. "You could have ruined him the moment he laid a hand on you," he said. There was no accusation in his tone, just bewildered respect. "Why wait?" She looked toward the horizon, that endless line of fire and sky where the desert swallowed the sun whole. Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. Power doesn't change people, she said. It reveals them. Vega didn't answer right away. He just stood beside her, letting the words settle. Around them, the base hummed with life again, not the sharp hum of tension, but something steadier, healthier. The men and women they led had seen what happened when silence met arrogance and didn't flinch. They'd seen what kind of strength lived behind restraint. The whir of rotor blades broke through the quiet. A helicopter circled overhead, descending in a swirl of dust. The wind tore across the parade ground, whipping at their uniforms, pulling the sound of shouted commands into a wild, scattered echo. Mara turned toward it, the sunlight flashing against her collar. Vega raised his voice over the noise. "You really think they'll remember all this?" She gave a small, knowing smile, the kind that never reached her eyes but meant everything. "They won't have to," she said. "It'll change how they lead." The chopper touched down, the gusts flattening the flags along the yard. Mara climbed aboard without looking back, her movements smooth and unhurried. She took a seat by the window as the doors closed, the roar of the engines swallowing the world below. From above, Fort Kestrel looked smaller, the barracks, the motor pool, the training fields, all shrinking into a patch of dust and light. But even from that height, the change was visible. Soldiers below stood in tighter formation, heads high, their shadows stretching long and proud across the ground. Vega stood at the edge of the landing zone, hand lifted in salute, dust swirling around his boots. The others followed suit not out of obligation, but out of choice. It wasn't for her rank, or her record, or even the quiet victory she'd won. It was for what she'd shown them. The helicopter lifted higher, banking toward the open desert. Mara watched until the base blurred into the horizon, until the only thing left was the hum of the rotors and the reflection of sunlight in the glass. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of it all settle. Strength, she thought, had never been about power. It was about control, the kind that didn't need to shout, didn't need to hurt, didn't need to prove. It was the kind that could stand in the face of fury, wait, and then deliver truth with precision. As Fort Kestrel faded behind her, the lesson remained carved into the desert wind and the hearts of every soldier who had watched her rise. True strength isn't in striking back. It's in knowing when to deliver justice and doing it so quietly that the world listens anyway.